For today's painting, I'm going to do a mixture of palette knife and finger painting. I was doing a palette knife painting recently and discovered that I, by accident, started finger painting because it wasn't coming out exactly like I wanted. And I found that by using my fingers, I could manipulate the paint a little bit differently, and I was quite happy with the result. I would recommend that you use gloves. I'm going to try using a pair of gloves. I'm sure that's much better for your hands and things. But when I did it the other day, I just used my finger, and I used acrylic paints, and so it washes off. But I'm sure for safety purposes, you should actually use gloves. So to get started, I'm going to lay down my basic coats. Then I'll start using the palette knife to kind of pencil, to sketch in what I want to do, and then I will go back and use my fingers. And I just kind of play with it as I go along. So what I actually end up doing may be different than what I'm telling you right now. And I actually filmed the beginning of this, but unfortunately I had bumped the camera and it was actually not filming what I was doing. So I'm going to explain what I've already done, and then hopefully I'll be able to film the rest of it. I started by painting a base coat. I don't stick to just palette or just finger paint or just brush. This painting I decided to actually do a full combination of whatever I feel like at any given time. So I used a combination of ultramarine, blue, and white to paint across the top here that was the sky part. And you can see how I do skies in some of my other videos. And for the hill area, I used burnt umber, and I pulled down a little bit of the pink that I had gone back with, that I had used with a palette knife at the top, and pulled that down through here. But basically I painted just an area of not really paying a whole lot of attention to the color, using the burnt umber and buff. Buff is basically unbleached unbleached white, whereas titanium white is the bleached white. So this was painted with this brush, all pretty much one color of shades of brown. And this has yet to be palette painted. Then I went back to my sky, and with this palette knife, I just use a plastic knife. I actually found that I liked it better than some of my inexpensive metal knives. Someday maybe I'll get some good metal knives. Then I went over my sky with a combination of ultramarine blue and pink and white. And I just scraped in various directions, and you can see how I do that if you watch my Seaside Poppy palette knife painting video. And I decided that I really liked the pink in there because it gives it a really spring happy feeling. And this painting is based on a hike that I did recently, and the 2017 spring desert bloom was absolutely outstanding this year all around the Southwest. I live in Arizona. So I wanted to capture what I actually saw that day, but I also wanted to capture the mood. And so as I went along, I brought in some kind of pretty colors. So once I was finished palette painting over the top of the sky, then I came back and palette painted the hills. And again, I'm sorry you didn't get to see any of that, but you'll watch me from here on. And then with the hills, after I put down some colors with my palette paint knife, I used actually my fingers and went through and smoothed them out, and I brought some of the pink down from the sky. And I like to use some of the same colors scattered around the painting because it kind of helps bring the whole painting together. And I have done paintings that are much more detailed and more realism to them. This is more of an impressionistic type painting. And I think of that as your brain interprets what it's seeing. So I'm not concerned about whether these hills are real crisp or if you see little brush marks or things like that. and it was an absolutely beautiful day. Nature is beautiful, and I love the Pacific Northwest, which is where I come from, but I also love the desert Southwest. And there's a lot of beauty out there, and that's what I'd wanted to capture. So now I will put some palette paint down here. What you see is just the base coat, which is what I had started with up here in these two layers. And then I will add some palette work, and then I'll do some finger painting. And what I mentioned before, which I'm not keeping that part of the video, obviously, it's probably a good idea to use gloves. I didn't use gloves in here. I may try some gloves when I do this section. Okay, so now I have my base coat down here, as I mentioned, and I'm going to add the palette knife work across here, and then I'll do a little finger painting and things. Then I'll add my tree, and then I'll come back and add any detail that I feel is necessary. And I'd printed out some of the photos that I had taken that day, just to kind of help remind me of what the feeling of the day was. So I'm not actually painting any specific scene that I saw, but I'm remembering what I saw and somewhat looking at my photos. So this is just laying down the color. And this is actually foreground here. And then there will be some shrubs and things like that in here. And this is much further off. This piece right here is not really the base of that hill. This is like a ridge right here, and then you would go down in, and that's way off in the distance. So even though this is somewhat abstract, I still need to make sure that my perspective is correct and that it still has to look realistic in its own way. I've decided to bring this down a little bit. I kind of like to have this foreground curving a bit more, so it looks like this is a hill that's up closer and that this is all in the background. So I have to let this sort of dry a bit. So this is all kind of ties in. Okay, and then as that dries, I'll do my foreground hill. And I work kind of quickly because there I've thrown in just a bit of pink just to kind of bring that color down. Your eye won't necessarily go right to that and think, oh, there's some pink ground there, but it just ties the whole painting together. If your eye does notice it, your brain registers it as shadows and highlights and maybe some wild flowers. And then don't forget to use actual white. See, there's the hooker green. You can see how bright that is. So I am very careful with hooker green for this type of painting. It's okay to have some green in there, but I don't want the eye to go right there and say, ooh, there's some really bright green that doesn't really go with the painting. Now, a lot of artists, they like to use a lot of real bright colors and things, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But we all have our own styles, and that's okay. Now I have pretty much just white on my brush. Not my brush, but my palette knife. You know what I mean. Kind of helps give it that abstract look. A bit of an abstract anyway. And then I just go in and kind of blend it around how I want. Here in the desert, paint dries up quickly, so I have to work fairly quickly here. And I don't have to totally take out my palette look. In fact, I'm finding as I go along here, I really don't want to. But I'll smooth some lines here. Sometimes just dipping your finger in the water works real well too. Remember that it's probably a better idea to wear gloves. I'm just not doing that. I kind of like to just feel the paint. And I may go back and add a little more palette look to it because I kind of lost my palette look, and I like that on there. You can kind of blend the two. I mean, I like the look of palette. This just sort of fades away in the background a little. Just add a little bit of detail up in there. And when I'm all finished, I'll go back and add a lot more detail with the palette knife. But this gives me my eye kind of wants to go right there because that's kind of bright, so I'll tone that down. And the rest I kind of like it, but I'll touch that up a little bit too. Don't want that too bright because I don't want that. I want this to definitely be the foreground, so, but I don't want that to be super distinct there either, so I'll kind of have to play around with that a little until I get that how I like it. Oh, I accidentally got a little red thrown in there, but I kind of like that. And then again, I'll have to let that dry, I think, a little bit. I don't know. Maybe add a little palette. That kind of gives a feeling that that's a bit of foreground there. So, you know, you just, every time I say, oh, okay, I'm going to let that sit now for a little while, then I don't. Sometimes I wish I did. But the main thing is you just keep working at it until it feels right to you. And again, I'm going to be adding a big tree in here, so that will completely change the look of everything. So now I've done all three sections. I painted my base coat of that area, kind of just basically the ultramarine blue and white, and then I went over it with my palette knife. And then I did this section and in basically just shades of brown and with a brush, and then I went over it with a palette knife, and then I completely finger painted it out. And that way this has a very smooth look. There's no palette marks anywhere left in it really. And then I did my ground. As you saw, I had the base coat using buff, and then which is unbleached titanium white, and then I went over it with the palette, and then I used my fingers to finger paint wherever I felt it needed it, and then I also did some palette work with it. So now I will put in a big tree that will sit pretty much right here, and then I'll go in and add wildflowers, and I think that it's kind of capturing what I felt that day. I think it was a very peaceful day, and it was very beautiful. Okay, now I'm going to use my palette knife to just very carefully etch in what I'm planning to have as my tree basic form. And just take a little bit of dark brown here. I'm using raw umber with a tiny bit of, there's a little white on there too. And I'm just kind of thinking about because I could use a regular brush for this as well. So I'm just sort of looking at kind of basically what I want as a nice shape for the tree. Some kind of interesting branches across this way. And then I'll go back and add some detail. I probably will do a lot of finger painting on the tree here. Part can come up this way. I'm still just using the real dark brown, the raw umber with some white, and the white automatically puts in some highlights for me, and I'll go back and add other tones, probably some golds. Add a little character to the tree. I'll have a little palette work down here, but I want to add a little shading under the tree. I add my darks and lights together as I go along. I have some shadows in here, and then I come back and put in some little highlights. And the brain will fill in for you where you have different branches behind. So at this point, I just keep laying down coats of paint with my palette knife. Oh, I got a little bit bright there. That could be catching the sun on that side. Kind of add to the shape of your tree while you're doing this. Kind of wherever you feel like it needs to go. At this point, it's just kind of fun to play around and create shapes. just kind of dabbing a little bit of finger paint type stuff here. That's pretty bright, so I'll go back and change some of that. It's a good way to kind of just lay down some different tones, different texture. You can see how different something can look just by using different tools. Going back and adding little negative space areas like that add some interest too. Those are just little shadows. Tone that down. And now I have an area that's quite dark and noticeable, so I'll have to let that dry. It's hard for me to do, but otherwise I'll start getting that area too thick. There were lots of little yellow blossoms on the various trees out in the desert that day, as well as on the shrubs that were on the ground. That was a bright sunny day. I'm not really worried about where I have my light source here in this painting. I just would like the whole thing to be lit up and pretty. Kind of helps bring the eye down to some little things going on here on the ground. Don't want too much color going up that way because that's going off into the distance. Kind of just blend that in a little better. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you've seen this little frazzly brush. I love this little brush. I use it for lots of little final details where I just want to kind of go back and bring something out that maybe needs a little bit of something. Kind of soften that up some. So the more little tools you have, the better, because they're all used for something a little different. And when I destroy a brush, which I often do, I will keep it for this sort of thing. Okay, so now I'm getting to that point where I just kind of need to stop fussing with it. Okay, I think I'm going to stop right there.